In August of 1987, West Germany's Social Democratic Party and East Germany's Socialist Unity Party did something interesting. They published a paper together, jointly, beginning with, "Our new situation in world history is that humanity can only survive together or perish together." It then went on to acknowledge each other's right to peacefully coexist. As historian Katja wrote, the West Germans and East Germans who had been working on this paper together since 1984 had essentially agreed that there was no need for a Cold War to be won or lost anymore. So why didn't this end the Cold War, right there, in Germany at least, on the spot? Well, because East Germany hadn't broken up with their current partner, the Soviet Union, yet. You see, they had been going through a bit of a rough patch recently, but they were high school sweethearts, kind of. And if anybody could make it work, they could. Seeing that it's almost 40 years later and neither country exists anymore, I think you can guess how this went. It got messy. So first, the SPD, the Social Democrats, they weren't in power in West Germany when this paper was published. In fact, they hadn't been in power in West Germany since 1982. But upon leaving office, they had embarked on a course of maintaining an important profile, and one of the ways they went about doing this was maintaining a dialogue with the East Germans. The basic idea was that the SPD could differentiate itself in the 1980s by attempting to thaw the Cold War. I don't know if you know much about the Cold War in the 80s, but 1983 alone almost ended the world. Whoops! As part of these party contacts, the SPD's Basic Values Commission and the Academy of Social Sciences at the Central Committee of the Socialist Unity Party also met to discuss ideological issues that crossed East-West lines. Multiple rounds of these meetings happen, and what develops is, as Deutschlandfunk Radio described in 1988, the realization that peace in the nuclear age can no longer be achieved by arming against each other. Rather, it can only come by making agreements with each other. Consequently, for both partners, the common struggle for peace also requires new forms of political exchange, a willingness for dialogue, a culture of ideological dispute in which each side accepts the right of the other to exist, and a capacity for peace and reform. The paper, believe it or not, also went over how each side disagreed with each other on many things, but recognized as communists and social democrats, they had more in common than these differences. And what were those differences in the face of peace? And that's all well and good, but there was a major problem for the Social Democrats with this paper. They had basically given up the idea of German unification. To say this was controversial is putting it mildly. While the basic law for the Federal Republic of Germany, their constitution, is most well known today for Article 1, Sentence 1, which reads, "Human dignity shall be inviolable," what is less well known outside of history dorks is that before 1990, the preamble to the basic law said something else. This basic law of the Federal Republic of Germany is also on behalf of those Germans to whom participation was denied. The entire German people is called upon to accomplish, by free self-determination, the unity and freedom of Germany. An explicit call for unification. This paper went over like a lead balloon in West Germany, with members of the SPD distancing themselves from the paper, and the conservative Christian Democratic Union just made political hay out of this. To them, it was just empty promises by the East German state in the run-up to East German leader Erich Honecker visiting. And with how East Germany quickly also retracted their support for the paper and doubled down on hardline rhetoric, which we will get to in a moment, the SPD is basically left feeling like they had found out that their prom date had stood them up and then got married to somebody else on national television. But like all good trashy romance novels, there was a reason that East Germany had a sudden change of heart, and no, it wasn't because they suddenly realized that finding their cousin super sexy was kind of weird. Let's start with what the Stasi recorded, because why wouldn't they? Older party members were highly skeptical of this document, especially in light of the bitter experiences of the German workers' movement history. Steve, just what were those experiences? Well, glad you asked. You see, in the twilight of World War I, revolutions broke out all across Germany, many of them being led by communist or communist-associated organizations. I do not have enough time in my life to describe the nuances of all of them. Anyways, this causes a lot of chaos in who comes in to wrest the power away from these communist groups for the new republic that's been formed in Weimar. That's right, the Social Democrats. Hence the refrain by German communists, "Who betrayed us? Social Democrats." I look forward to your comments about how inaccurate this all was. Anyway, the ideas expressed in this paper were decidedly against Marxist-Leninist doctrine. They essentially agreed that the revolutionary workers' movement had stagnated, because there should be no reason to peacefully coexist if the revolution is marching ever forward. And even though East Germany had abandoned its claims to all of Germany in the mid-1970s, These were still capitalist imperialists, not people you tolerated. But to the more reform-minded members of the Socialist Unity Party, this paper was a lifeline. Sure, it means compromising the ideals of the East German state, but as Hoyer pointed out, those were easily bartered away for assurances of continued existence. This is why Erich Honecker, the leader of East Germany, had personally approved the paper as a historic document. The largest struggle East Germany had for their entire existence was getting people outside of the communist nations to agree that they had legitimacy in that existence. And now, bam, their ex next door said, hey, I know I said some rotten things about you and your boyfriend in the past, but, you know, maybe we can vague post about each other a little bit less. And that's the thing. Said boyfriend, oh, okay, I'm dropping this metaphor. It's getting way too strained at this point. The timing for putting out this paper seems perfect. The Soviet Union had recently adopted the policy of openness, glasnost if you would. And its leader Mikhail Gorbachev had even encouraged the use of Western terms and sources within the Soviet Union. So imagine the Socialist Unity Party's surprise when the reaction by the Soviet Union to this paper is, why would you do that? To quote from historian Vladislav Zubok, Gorbachev developed unique relationships with Western leaders, especially Ronald Reagan, Francois Mitterrand, Spain's leader Felipe González, Italy's Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti, Britain's Margaret Thatcher, and the West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl during frequent trips to the West. He began to discuss with his interlocutors how to change the Soviet Union. Gorbachev introduced the voices of Western leaders and what they discussed with him into the debates at the Politburo. He also inserted the commentariat of the West into the ongoing debates about the nature and scope of Soviet reforms. At the Politburo, Gorbachev quoted from the New York Times, the Financial Times, The Economist, and other major Western sources of opinion. This also opened the way for terms and concepts never before used in internal discourse. The Soviet Union could now be called an empire. The words pluralism, crisis, totalitarianism, and Stalinism became acceptable. Gradually, the vocabulary from Western sources, as well as from the work of Soviet journalists, social scientists, and writers, would supplant the old Soviet vocabulary. From East Germany's point of view, with the leader of the Soviet Union palling around with Western leaders and liberally quoting from Western sources, the timing of releasing a paper with a West German left-of-center party couldn't be more perfect. It is exactly in line with what the Soviet Union's doing. Instead, there is a clear line from the Soviet Union in response. Fix this! According to Hoyer's account, Egon Krenz, the future leader of East Germany for about 5 minutes, was stunned by who provided the rebuke. Krenz met with none other than Alexander Yakovlev, who had been the intellectual architect of the concept of glasnost and perestroika. Krenz was convinced that what the SPD-SED paper suggested was the embodiment of glasnost, openness. But according to Krenz, Yakovlev was not impressed. He found that it implicitly criticized Soviet power, while the American strategy of confrontation and rearmament against the socialist states was not mentioned. Yakovlev told him he expected the SED to interact with the SPD on a foundation of Marxism, not popular Marxism. He ended his rebuke by telling Comrade Krenz that he should try to rectify this failure, else the document won't be worth the paper it is written on. This was followed up with basically an itemized list from the Soviet embassy about all the ways this mistake could have been avoided. Essentially, to the more reform-minded members of the Socialist Unity Party, they had just been told that Gorbachev's talks of openness, reform, and using Western voices were just for him and the Soviet Union alone. East Germany was to remember its place. But to the hardline members of the Socialist Unity Party, this also pissed them off. About 4 months prior to the paper coming out, the head of ideology for the Socialist Unity Party, Kurt Hager, had given an interview to the West German Stern magazine. We German communists have always felt great respect and admiration towards the land of Lenin. This does not mean, nor did it mean in the past, that we copied everything that happened in the Soviet Union. If your neighbor re-wallpapered his apartment, would you feel obliged to do the same? He then watched his party dip their toes into that reform, and the Soviet Union basically smacked them for doing so. It was clear to him and other hardliners that the Soviet Union was going too far with their reforms and were out of control. Hager would then announce in a speech in October of 1987, "We will not stop fighting the aggressive forces of imperialism as foes, as enemies of the peaceful life of humanity." It's assumed at the time this was mainly directed towards the West, but with things happening in East Germany, this is also directed at the Soviet Union. Simultaneously, East Germany starts censoring news and magazines coming from the Soviet Union. This famously results in the banning of the Soviets' Sputnik magazine, which published an article that more or less called into question the historic narrative that the Socialist Unity Party based its legitimacy on. If Gorbachev wanted to run around acting like he was a friend of Western liberalism, well, that was on him. And apparently it was only for him. From the East German side, he had no desire for the East Germans to be a legitimate partner. Further, he was then allowing his own openness to undermine the Socialist Unity Party, his East German allies, while simultaneously not allowing them to do the same reforms that were allowing his country to move forward. So thus, to the East German hardliners, there was only one way that they were going to get their entire country out of this position: extreme discipline. And to those who chanted Gorbachev's name in protest of this new discipline, well, that was on them to later learn that it was Gorbachev's fault that this was happening in the first place. It was like a million degrees upstairs. Anyways, obviously this is just a single entry in the fracturing of the relationship between East Germany and the Soviet Union. There were many things happening concurrently to these events. Ronald Reagan's tear down this wall speech happened in the exact middle of this story. But it does neatly showcase something that I've often found missing in the Western narrative of the Cold War. East Germany, above all else, craved to be treated like a legitimate state. And for years the Soviet Union had pushed to the West that they weren't simply just a puppet state. And then right as this perfect moment happens in history where they can carve out this full identity as this legitimate state that can act in their own interest, no, their chain is yanked and they're told that that is not something they can do. This wasn't the West treating East Germany like they were a puppet who had gotten out of pocket. This was their own ally, their chief benefactor, the state where they had learned all their ideology from, the Soviet Union. And if the Soviet Union won't treat them as legitimate, then should they even treat the Soviet Union as legitimate? Oh, postscript on 3 October 1990, East Germany would cease to be.